Hello, this is BBC News. I'm Lewis Vaughan-Jones with the latest headlines for viewers here in the UK and around the world. The United States has announced it will require negative COVID tests for travellers from China following growing alarm at the rapid increase in Chinese infections. Tighter measures have also been announced by Italy, Japan, Taiwan and India amid concern China's case numbers aren't accurate. It sparked an angry response from Beijing.
The argument you mentioned is a biased smear campaign and political manipulation with a hidden agenda, which doesn't stand up to scrutiny and runs counter to the truth.
As people flee Kherson, Ukraine says Russia has carried out more than 30 rocket attacks in the past 24 hours alone. Pope Francis asks people to pray for his predecessor, Benedict XVI, who he says is very ill. The Vatican says Benedict's condition has worsened in recent hours. And Britain is on course to record its warmest year ever after a summer of heat waves, wildfires and drought. Hello, welcome to the programme. America has become the latest country to impose mandatory COVID tests on Chinese tourists after Beijing announced it would reopen its borders next week. It comes as China's COVID cases surge. Tighter measures have also been imposed by Italy, Japan, Malaysia, Taiwan and India. Our diplomatic correspondent Paul Adams reports.
From the world's most populous nation, alarming scenes. China's hospitals overwhelmed, COVID infections soaring. The country's abrupt decision to dismantle much of its strict COVID regime apparently yielding worrying results, wards full of desperately ill people. Outside this hospital in Chengdu, a queue for emergency services. Government officials say the situation is under control. That's not what these pictures suggest. At the Dongjiao funeral home, one of the city's biggest, more evidence of the scale of the problem. One funeral procession after another. Workers here say they're so busy they have no time to eat. And yet China is opening up, about to relax rules for inbound travellers and making it easier for Chinese citizens to travel abroad. Welcome news for travel companies after 3 bleak years.
Since this morning, we've had lots of inquiries from our customers. They're asking whether they can travel abroad normally again, whether they'll need to quarantine on their return, and when international tourism will return.
It's hard to know just how bad China's coronavirus situation really is. China says it recorded 5,231 new COVID cases yesterday and just 3 deaths nationwide. But people are no longer required to declare infections to the authorities, so the official figures are unlikely to tell the full story. And so, neighbouring countries, Japan, Malaysia, Taiwan and India, all worried about the possibility of importing COVID cases, have already announced tighter measures for Chinese travellers, including the requirement for negative tests. Tonight, American officials, citing a lack of Chinese transparency, have followed suit. In a week's time, all people arriving from China will have to have proof of a negative test. And in Europe, Italy has become the first country to say it's making coronavirus tests mandatory. Back in Beijing, officials reject any suggestion that China has lost control.
The argument you mentioned is a biased smear campaign and political manipulation with a hidden agenda, which doesn't stand up to scrutiny and runs counter to the truth.
After last month's nationwide protests, this is the image China wants to project. A country finally turning its back on the virus and on its own draconian response. But China's long, hard battle with COVID is far from over. Paul Adams, BBC News.
Well, earlier I spoke to Professor of Medicine at Harvard Medical School, Dr. Daniel Kuritzkis, who was sceptical of the efficacy of travel restrictions.
I can certainly understand the concern about the potential for importation of new variants from other parts of the world, but in reality, these measures are very unlikely to have any significant impact in reducing risk. So I think these are more about public relations and perhaps a bit about foreign policy than they are really about public health.
Interesting, because most people watching, I'm sure, will be looking at the increasing in case numbers in China and won't want to see that kind of level of A, numbers, and B, as you mentioned, potential variants being imported into the country. It would seem to make common sense. Are you suggesting that actually the evidence from what we know over the last couple of years is that actually it doesn't make a great deal of difference?
I think that's right. Unless you impose truly draconian limits, as was done, for example, successfully in Australia and New Zealand, having testing or other sorts of partial travel bans are really not effective. Look what happened a year ago when the United States imposed travel bans to South Africa and other South African countries in response to the detection of Omicron. That did nothing to halt the explosive spread of Omicron variants in the United States because they had already spread to other parts of the world. I think the same would be true here. If there is to be a new variant that arises in China, it most likely has already spread elsewhere, and because of travel to third-party countries and the like, a person traveling from China to France could then infect someone in France who would travel to the United States without testing and allow entry of the variant.
Interesting. And what do you make of China and its handling in recent weeks of the epidemic there?
I think that the relaxation of their very strict lockdown measures has happened a bit abruptly, considering how vaccination has not been as widespread and certainly not with as effective a vaccine as has been the case in most of Europe and the United States. I understand the pressure to relax the very strict shutdowns that they had had. But after so many years, you would have thought they might have done so a little bit more gradually and with more forethought.
And the authorities came out very strongly, have come out very strongly, criticising foreign countries for turning a blind eye, as it says, to their own measures and their own problems, and instead focusing too much on criticising China's approach. But when you take a step back from the politics of it and different countries criticising each other's approaches, where does the world stand now? It seems like you're saying that actually all borders should be open, it will spread as it will spread, and it will be as it will be.
I think the most important things that we can do are to ensure that the world population is vaccinated with effective vaccines, highly effective vaccines, and that where there are high numbers of cases, that appropriate non-biological measures such as masking and social distancing are implemented in order to minimize the spread. But I think the experience has shown that travel bans by themselves are unlikely to have any significant impact in halting the global spread of this pandemic virus.
Thanks to Dr. Daniel Kuritzkis for that. Now, Ukraine says Russia has